Hello, in this session we'll be starting to look at playing with longer samples. So in Tidal, so far we've mainly looked at working with short sounds and patterning them into rhythms, which is something that Tidal is pretty good at. But it's also pretty good at playing with longer samples. So in the next few sessions we'll be looking at that. Let's have a look in the code. Okay. So I suppose the thing about Tidal is that you're dealing with trigger messages. So when we make a pattern, we're making a pattern of messages to send to SuperDirt saying, make this sound. So for example, this 4 times a second, well, we're speeding it up by 2, so 8 times a cycle, rather, not second. It will send a message to SuperDirt to say, play this now. Or slightly in the future, because it works a little bit ahead of time, just to keep all the timing completely bang on. But the problem is that sometimes we want to have the sounds interact, or we want to have a sound and cut it up into bits to rework it. But that's fine. There's ways of getting around all this. So to start with, let's think about the case of a hi-hat. So this is the drum. There's 2 cymbals that hit together. You can hit them with the stick when they're open, and then it makes a nice long sound, but then you can close the hi-hat and then it'll stop any sound that is currently reverberating, and also create a kind of sharp sound. So this is what I mean. This is like a hi-hat open. This is a bit longer. And this is a hi-hat closed. That's what HO and HC stand for. So the problem is that normally when you play sounds, when you trigger them, they overlap. So this sound is longer than a quarter of a cycle, so it'll overlap with this one. That's normally something that you probably want to happen, but in the case of a hi-hat, it just makes it sound kind of unrealistic. So one way around that is to do a cut group. So here I've got cut 1. And maybe you can already hear when that hi-hat is closed, the tail is cut off the open hi-hat sound. The difference is pretty subtle, but it just sounds a lot better, really. So that's one way of doing that. You have to be a bit careful with cut groups, because if you have 2 things using the same cut group, then they will overlap, or at least it used to. Like at the moment, this will actually work fine. And the reason for that is that behind the scenes, Tidal adds this to each one. So D1 will go to orbit 1 and D2 will go to orbit 2. And the good thing about these being in different orbits is that they'll have separate cut groups and separate reverb, separate delays. So you can treat these like different audio channels. If I actually put them both in the same orbit, you kind of hear that that kick drum is overwriting all of the hi-hats completely. It's just cutting them out. And that's because they're in the same orbit. That's a bit of a technicality, because these days, unless you put stack things up into the same pattern, which I'll show you at some point, you don't really have to worry about that too much anymore. It'll automatically put them in separate orbits with separate cut groups. Okay, but maybe that will, in the future, when you get something weird happening with cut groups, you'll remember, Alex said something weird happens if you have them in the same pattern, and then you'll be able to refer back to this video. So welcome to your future self. there was the answer. Right, so there's another way, slightly newer way of dealing with this problem, which is subtly different. So, and that's legato. This, I think, is a music term. I never did any music properly, so I just know it as the thing in Tidal for making a sound fit its step. So, for example, this sax sound is pretty long. So if I hush this now, it just keeps going for ages. So one way around that would be to put it in a cut group. You can hear that each time it plays, it's cutting the previous version of itself and keeps it a bit under control. But then when I hush it, there's nothing cutting it anymore. So it just carry on playing for ages still. And if we look at the structure of this 3/8 Euclidean pattern, using this draw line function, it'll draw it out for us, and it shows there's an X, which is where the X happens, or in this case the sax, then 2 empty steps, then another X, then 2 more empty steps, then X, then another empty step. But because we're using cut groups, the sax is continuing to play up until the next X. It'll play over those empty spaces. That's not the same with legato. So if we hear this, we can actually hear that for the empty spaces, there's nothing playing. There's a gap in between. So that's the difference between cut and legato. Legato will only play the sound for the step that a sound is active in. Maybe it's clearer if we add some silence in manually instead of using the Euclidean pattern. So you can kind of hear that's active for 1/4 of the cycle, and for the other 3 steps it's empty. Okay. So that's the difference between cut groups and legato. I tend to use legato just because it keeps things a bit more under control. But cut is also really fun to play with, and it just comes up, the results can be surprising and fun. So try them both out. I'll just try these out with some different kinds of samples, like we've got those breakbeats, so let's see what happens with that. Sounds okay with really short versions of it. If we like, you can hear it's not lining up. So this can help a bit with working with long samples, but it's not perfect. But we can make that perfect, which we'll do in the next video. So I'll see you there. Bye.